Okay. So, you know how like before a big launch of a new app or a website, everyone's making sure that it loads quickly, right?
Yeah.
Hitting it with those speed tests and stuff. That's kind of like load testing, right? It's that quick, slamming on the gas pedal and seeing if it can handle it.
Exactly. Yeah.
But then what happens, like a week later, a month later, a year later, when it's been running constantly?
Right.
That's where endurance testing comes in, right?
Yeah. It's like, you think about it, functional testing is checking what the software does, right? So, can you log in? Can you add things to the cart? All that.
Right.
Endurance testing is what we call non-functional testing, and that focuses on how well it does those things. So,
Yeah.
it's like, can it keep doing them reliably over, a really long time and under a good amount of use without its performance getting, really bad?
Right. So instead of just a sprint, it's a marathon for the software.
Yeah, exactly. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And the main goal is to make sure that it can handle that long-term use without the response times becoming like super slow.
Yeah, a marathon's a great way to put it. And when we say long haul, we really mean it like a load test might be a few hours, but an endurance test can be days, weeks, sometimes even like up to a year.
Wow.
Can you imagine like keeping something running at that high of a level for that long? There's a big difference in the time scale, right?
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes you might hear it called capacity testing.
Oh, okay.
And I think that really gets at what we're trying to figure out here. It's about figuring out if the system can handle those really long demands. Like, it's not about just surviving like a big rush of users or whatever. It's about keeping it stable and keeping the performance good when things are constantly busy.
Day after day.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right, so I think for this deep dive, our mission is pretty clear.
All right.
We really want to get into, what endurance testing is all about, why it's so important for making software that people can rely on, and what the testers are actually looking at during those, tests to make sure that everything's working right.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, let's get into it. What are we even trying to do with endurance testing? Why is it so important?
Well, the main thing that I think developers really worry about is checking for memory leaks.
Okay.
It's like if you have a leaky faucet, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like one drip might not seem like a big deal, but, over weeks and months, it can cause like a lot of damage.
Right, yeah.
So in software, a memory leak is when like an application doesn't let go of the memory that it's using.
Okay.
And so under a lot of use for a long time, these little leaks can build up and eventually like crash the system or even cause problems for the whole operating system,
So it can really bring the whole thing down.
Yeah, it's kind of a silent killer.
Yeah, that's a crazy thought.
Yeah.
It's not something you would see in a quick test, would you?
Right, yeah.
It's like a hidden problem that just gets worse over time.
Yeah.
What else are we trying to find with this kind of testing?
Well, we also need to see how the whole system works, like how well it's performing when it's being used all the time. It's not enough for it to just not crash,
Right, it has to actually work well, too.
Yeah, we need to see if the response times are still okay for the user. Like, does the application slow down a lot after a few hours? Does it eventually just stop working completely? These are the kinds of things that endurance testing helps us figure out.
So we want it to always work well, not just at the beginning, but all the time.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's not just about right now, it's also about planning for the future. Endurance testing tells us how much the system can handle. Like how many users, how many transactions can it deal with and still perform well?
Right. Good.
And that information is super valuable when you're thinking about growing your system and what you need to do that.
So it's kind of like having a weather forecast for the system's resources.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
By watching how it behaves under pressure for a while,
Yeah.
we can figure out when we need to, give it more power, more processors, more memory, all that stuff to be ready for more users in the future.
Yeah, exactly. And it takes the guesswork out of it,
Okay.
And another thing to remember is that endurance testing isn't always about just throwing a ton of users at the system,
Okay.
Sometimes it's about taking away some of the system's resources and seeing how the application handles that over time. The main idea is the same, though. We're looking at what happens when the system is stressed out for a long time.
I see.
And the whole point, like we talked about before, is to find those hidden problems, those memory leaks that you just wouldn't find in a shorter test. These are the things that can really cause trouble down the line.
Okay, so we've got the why of endurance testing down. It's about finding those long-term weaknesses and planning for the future. Now, what are the testers looking at during these tests?
Well, like we talked about before, memory leaks are a big one. Those little leaks, if you don't catch them, they can be really bad because they slowly use up more and more memory until the system just can't work anymore. So testers are always watching how much memory is being used and looking for any increases that shouldn't be there. It's like checking your bank account for, weird
Yeah,
transactions.
making sure nobody's stealing your money.
Exactly. You want to catch it early before it becomes a problem.
Makes sense. What about that connections within the system itself? I saw that was something they look at too.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Most software nowadays isn't just one thing. It's a bunch of different parts all connected together and talking to each other.
Right.
Endurance testing checks to make sure that those connections are closed properly when they're not needed anymore. If they stay open for no reason, it can cause problems and slow things down. It's like a highway suddenly going from, 6 lanes down to one.
Oh, wow. So it's like a traffic jam inside the software.
Pretty much, yeah.
Uh,
And we also have to pay attention to database connections. Those are really important.
okay, why is that?
Well, just like those internal connections we were talking about, the application needs to talk to the database to save and get information right.
Right.
If those connections aren't managed well and they stay open forever, they can really overload the database server and maybe even crash the whole system.
Oh, wow.
So the testers are watching how those database connections are opened and closed throughout the whole test. It's about protecting the heart of the system.
Got it. So it's all about making sure that nothing gets overloaded over time, whether it's the memory, the internal connections, or the database.
Exactly.
And the last big thing we watch is the response time. That one seems pretty obvious. But how is looking at it during endurance testing different than just checking it normally?
It's all about looking at it over a long period of time.
Okay.
You might have great response times at the beginning of the test, but what we want to see is if those times get worse over hours or even days of continuous use.
Right.
If it slows down, it could mean that there are some underlying problems, like those memory leaks we talked about, or that the system isn't managing resources very well, or that there are bottlenecks in the database that only show up under stress.
So we're not just looking at the initial speed. We're looking for any slow decline that the users would notice and get frustrated with.
Right, exactly.
Okay, cool. So now we know the what and the why of endurance testing.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how we actually do it.
All right, so the first thing, like with any kind of testing, is to set up the right environment.
Makes sense.
That means getting all the right hardware and software and operating systems that match the real-world environment that the users will be using.
Right.
And it also means figuring out who on the testing team is going to do what. But something that's really important here, and that might surprise you, is that we need to think about how big the database is and how much it's going to grow in the future.
Oh, that's interesting. Why is that so important for endurance testing?
Well, it's because we're trying to make the test as realistic as possible. We need to understand how the application is going to work, not just with the data it has now, but also with way more data that it's probably going to have in like a year, 2 years, 5 years.
Wow.
So part of setting up the test might be making a fake database that's that big and seeing how the application handles it.
So you're trying to make the test like a time machine almost.
Yeah,
Sure.
exactly. We're trying to be prepared for the future.
I like that. So
Yeah.
once we have the environment all set up, like it's 5 years in the future, then what?
Then we make a test plan and come up with some specific scenarios to test.
Okay.
That means deciding if we're going to do it manually with people or automatically with computers or a mix of both.
Yeah.
And then we design and review and actually run those tests. A really important part of this is to include tests that really push the system to its limits and something called breakpoint testing.
Breakpoint testing. That sounds kind of intense. What's that?
So breakpoint testing is all about finding the exact point where the application breaks or starts acting weird under a lot of continuous pressure.
Oh.
It's about finding the absolute limit of what the system can handle over a long period of time.
So you're not just seeing if it can survive, you're seeing exactly when and how it breaks.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And another important thing is giving a realistic estimate of how long the testing is going to take. You need to figure out how long the whole endurance testing phase will take based on how many testers you have and how many times you're going to run the tests, because endurance tests can take a long time. This can be tricky. You have to think about not just how long it takes to run the test, but also how long it takes to look at the results and maybe even run them again if you find problems.
Yeah, that makes sense. You have to account for the time to figure out what happened and then fix things too.
Yeah.
What about, anticipating any problems that might come up during these long tests?
That's where risk analysis comes in.
Okay.
It's super important to think ahead and figure out any risks that might come up during endurance testing and to have a plan for what to do about them. This includes figuring out which parts of the system are the riskiest and testing those first. And you also need to think about challenges that the testers might face during these long tests.
Like what?
Like, will the performance stay good for the whole test? Are there any hidden problems that will only show up after a long time? Is there anything outside the system that we haven't thought about that could mess things up?
Yeah, you definitely don't want any surprises.
Right. And lastly, we need a schedule to keep everything organized. That part's pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, that seems like it. What does that involve?
So the schedule tells us how much money we have for testing and what we're supposed to deliver and when. It's important to remember that endurance testing is about putting a realistic amount of stress on the system over a long period of time. It's not about short bursts of crazy activity. It's about sustained, normal activity.
Okay, I think I get it now. So we've talked about the what, the why, and the how.
Yeah.
Can we look at an example to really show the difference between endurance testing and other kinds of performance testing, like that stress testing we talked about earlier?
Yeah, for sure. So, like we said before, stress testing is like pushing the system as hard as you can right now and seeing what happens. It's like seeing how much weight a bridge can hold before it collapses.
Right.
But endurance testing is about looking at those limits over a longer period of time with a more realistic amount of pressure. It's like seeing if that same bridge can handle normal traffic all day, every day without falling apart.
So stress testing is the sprint, and endurance testing is the marathon.
Exactly.
That's a great analogy.
Mm.
So what kinds of problems do we usually find with endurance testing that we might miss with other shorter tests?
Well, memory leaks are a big one, like we talked about. Another common thing is problems with the database server that only show up after it's been under a lot of pressure for a long time.
Okay.
For example, you might find that temporary files aren't being deleted correctly, which makes the system slow down over time. We might also find that parts of the system stop responding after running for a long time, even if they seemed fine at first. It's those slow, sneaky problems that endurance testing is designed to catch.
So they're like hidden time bombs almost.
Yeah, kind of. And it really shows how important it is to do endurance testing, because if you don't, you might miss these really big problems before you launch the software.
Right. Your system might seem perfect for a little while, but endurance testing is what really tells you if it's going to be reliable for the user in the long run.
Exactly.
So for anyone listening who's involved in making software, what are some of the tools that are used for these endurance tests?
There are a bunch of good tools out there. Some popular ones are WebLoad Load Complete Apache JMeter. That one's open source. LoadRunner, Advanced Load UI, OpenSTA, another open source one, and Rational Performance Tester. These tools can create and manage that sustained pressure on the system, and they can also track all sorts of important performance data throughout the whole test.
It's cool that there are tools specifically for this kind of deep dive into long-term performance. So let's talk about the benefits of doing endurance testing. We've mentioned some already, but let's really lay them out for everyone.
One of the big benefits is that it tells us exactly how much work the system can handle under realistic conditions.
Right.
And that information is super valuable for your customers or whoever, because they can use it to decide if their current setup is good enough or if they need to upgrade things. It's like giving them evidence instead of just guesses.
Yeah, it takes the guesswork out of planning for the future.
Yeah.
What other benefits are there?
Well, it's really important for finding those performance problems that only show up after the system has been running hard for a while. You know, the kinds of problems that shorter tests would miss completely.
Right.
And also, by doing these tests, you can be more confident that your application will stay up and running even when there are sudden spikes in traffic, because you've already proven that it can handle that level of stress.
So it's not just about handling the everyday traffic. It's about being ready for those crazy busy times, too.
Exactly. And like you mentioned before, another big benefit is that we can see if the performance gets worse over time.
Right, that's important.
Yeah, it lets us catch any slow decline in things like response times or how efficiently the system is using its resources. And if we catch those problems early, we can fix them before they start affecting the users.
Makes sense. So those are some really good reasons why endurance testing is so important. But like anything, there are probably some downsides or challenges too, right? What are some of those?
Yeah, one of the tricky things is figuring out how much stress to put on the system during the test.
Yeah.
You know, it has to be enough to find potential problems, but not so much that it causes problems that wouldn't normally happen.
So it's a balancing act.
Exactly. And because you're purposely stressing the system for a long time, there's always a chance that something could break, like the application itself or even the network. Yeah, and that could cause some serious problems if your testing environment isn't totally separate from your live system. And there's also a chance, although it's not very likely, that you could lose data permanently if you push the system too hard for too long.
So you have to be really careful.
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes you might see that the system is still using a lot of resources even after you stop the test.
Oh, that's not good.
Right. It could mean that there's something wrong with how the application is managing its resources. And also, some parts of the application might stop responding for a bit during the test. And if you're not careful, those problems could spill over and affect real users.
Hmm.
So you have to watch everything very closely.
So it's not just about running the test, it's about making sure you have a really good plan and
Yeah.
that you're watching for any unexpected problems.
Exactly.
All right, we've talked about a lot today. Let's wrap things up with a quick summary of the most important points.
Okay, so just to recap, endurance testing is a specific kind of load testing that focuses on the long term. It can last for days, weeks, or even a year. The main goals are to find problems like memory leaks, to see how the system responds under pressure, and to make sure that the database connections are working well over time.
It's all about taking the long view. Well, that's the end of our deep dive into endurance testing. It's really amazing to learn about all the work that goes into making sure that the software we use every day is stable and reliable and works well even when it's under a lot of pressure. It just shows you how important this kind of testing is, even though we don't always see it.
Yeah. And what's really interesting to think about is that as software gets more and more complex, this kind of testing is only going to become more important and more challenging. What kinds of problems might we find in these big, complicated systems that only show up after they've been running in the real world for a long time?
Yeah, that's a good question.
It's definitely something to keep in mind as technology keeps changing.
I think that's a great place to end it. Thanks for joining me today. It was a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.